for decades in Palestine? What are the roots of this crisis? Why is it so difficult to reach a peaceful reconciliation between the two parties involved, the Israelis and the Palestinians? We're going to go back in history and try and understand all the steps that have led up to where we are today. We're joined by a professor of political science and strategic studies, Professor emaad.muhanna. Welcome so much. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Now, we don't want to go back to ancient times.
Exactly.
But we'll start. Can we please start with the First World War? Take us from there.
As we well know, that the conflict between the Arabs and Israeli just goes back to Prophet Ibrahim, you know, and his son Ismail, the father of the Arab, etc. So it is a quite long and deep conflict. Particularly after the First World War in 1916, basically the 4 years during the war and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the time, 1923, and the actual, dissolution of the actual Ottoman Empire at large, divided, and the colonial powers, including Italy, Britain, France, basically put their hands on certain countries in the Middle East. And the protection rule, particularly enforced by England, included Egypt, Palestine, and Lebanon, and remained in place until 1947 and 1948, and the war between the Arabs, the first war between the Arabs and Israelis. What basically happens during the Second World War particularly is the declaration of the establishment of the first Jewish state in Palestine. Basically, there were three countries proposed to be the Jewish state: was Zambia, Argentina, and Palestine. And because of the heritage of the Jewish religion in Palestine, they decided finally to make Palestine the Jewish state, official Jewish state. Europeans basically accepted that in 1906 and remained basically under that plan to enforce it, and it was the beginning of that plan was enforced in 1941 up until 1947.
Small side note, if I can. This happened before independence, the movement started.
Exactly.
So this was still the colonial mindset.
Exactly. It was during the Second World War. In 1945, which basically the establishment of the Arab League, and we talked about the history of the Arab League and how it basically started with the assistance of the British in terms of the actual charter itself, and it doesn't allow the Arab to vote for the Arab cases to be resolved. So in the end, in 1947, the Arabs were surprised to find the full declaration of establishment of the Jewish state. In 1948, President Nasser led the war against the Jewish state, and basically the war was lost. From that time, the conflict between, or real conflict between the Arabs and the Jews started. Followed with, after that, the resolution 181 from the United Nations, and basically to say that Israel has to withdraw, and basically 181 focus on dividing Palestine into two-state solution. So starting from the resolutions, for respected viewers, just to follow with us, there's a number of resolutions that were issued by the Security Council of the United Nations. The resolution 181 basically accepts or enforces the two-state solution, that Palestine has to be divided into two states. During that time, the Palestinian state amounted for about 64% of the total land, and the rest for the Jewish state. Followed by what we found in the 50s and the start of the independence days of a number of countries. Nobody really paid attention to the Palestinian case until we got into the 60s, and the major Six-Day War in 1967, and again the collapse of the Arab armament at the time couldn't really resolve the issue at all. And from that, we'll see 242 resolution, 338, and then the roadmap until the roadmap of 2002. So it's quite a long history of struggle, and that basically backed up by a weak League of the Arab States, no political vision to basically agree upon what is the solution, the ideal solution that they want for Palestinians.
Sorry, what was the the edge, the military edge that the Israelis had? Was it backing from Western governments such as Britain, etc.?
Absolutely.
Or was it that the Arabs were weak? Which was it?
Basically, if you talk about the 40s, yes, the Arabs were weak at the time. With the establishment of the Jewish state in 1947, they acquired a lot of nuclear heads. At this point, they're probably talking about 450 nuclear heads inside Israel. The army equipments exceed the army of Britain in terms of equipments. In 1950s and 60s, they were very much in line with the Egyptian nuclear program. And part of the deal end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, was to stop the nuclear program of Egypt. The difference was about 18 months between the two programs. Egypt stopped the nuclear program, and then Israel continued.
I'm sorry, I want to ask you to repeat what you just said. Did you say that Israel, in terms of military equipment, planes and jets and tanks and all this kind
exceeds the British military equipments, yes.
That is very telling.
It is. It is. And it's not classified on the top countries in the world, but it does basically exceed the British military, except certain parts of equipments like the aircraft carriers and stuff like that. But in terms of equipments, they do have quite a lot compared to the small size of land they live on. Then the 450 nuclear heads, these heads alone are capable of burning the entire Middle East from Russia west all the way to England.
We also know that the United States weapons, armaments that are legally U.S. are being stored, housed in Israel.
Israel enjoys a lot of privileges under the U.S. flag, not just military, but also economically, because Israel is regarded the safe house of the dollar, and we talked about the dollar and how it's basically regarded the main currency in the world in terms of international trade. So Israel enjoys a lot of privileges. In terms of equipments, military equipments, they always enjoy the edge ahead of any Arab state. The two states that we're always trying to catch up with Israel is Egypt and Iraq. Iraq was even more because they are richer in terms of oil, and Saddam was very much focused on acquiring new weapons all the time, particularly from Russia. And Russia always regarded Iran and Iraq, the two national security gates to Russia, so they always supplied them with advanced weapons. At this point, all you have in the region is the Egyptian army. So they're very much ahead of everybody.
So from the beginning, Israel has always been outgunned.
That's right.
Has outgunned the Arabs.
Yeah. If we actually go back in history and see how the struggle developed, it started with militias. During the 40s, it never really started as an official state with the president and government. It was always militias. They forced people to leave their homes. And you always find a lot of Palestinians carrying keys. These keys are basically the keys to their houses. They were thrown out of. So people are always, the Palestinians are always very proud to keep the keys of their old homes.
I've seen those.
So from the beginning, they always had that. The migration to the land of Israel was basically supported very much economically during the 50s by the European migrations. So after the Second World War and the continuous attacks of Hitler during the Second World War basically mobilized the entire Europe, or particularly the Jews in the entire Europe, to start moving outside Europe. So the deal was to basically get them into Palestine, so get more and more people, particularly from Russia, more and more people into the Middle East, so increase the number of population. At the same time, you're pushing Palestinians out. So at this point, you're talking about over 6 million Palestinians outside Palestine, but in terms of Israeli population, you're talking about 7.5 million. So the 6 million Palestinians that were thrown out of their homes were basically replaced by the Jews. From that time, and let's also be honest about why that conflict is always taking place and it's always hot. It's because of the economic resources. the superpowers always want somebody in the middle to keep the Middle East divided, because they're so worried that if the Middle East countries, particularly just the Arabs, you know, excluding Turkey and Iran, if the 23 countries can unite because of the unity in language and you know, distance, proximity, etc. So these people can have, with the 40% natural resources, these people can be the greatest economic power in the world. So therefore, they want somebody to always create that anarchy in the region. So Israel is that
serves
person.
that purpose.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. So we mentioned in the introduction that there were a number of efforts. What you're saying is, despite the initiatives, despite what's written on paper, there is just never going to be any will for anything fruitful, concrete to happen.
Absolutely, because you're talking now about 68 years. If you talk about resolutions alone, you've got 181, you've got 194, basically grants the Palestinians a return, safe return to Palestine. You've got 242, so Israel has to go back to the boundaries or the border of 1967, 338 that basically confirms that. You've got 1993 Oslo Declaration, 94 Camp David, and you've got 2000 the Arab Initiative, 2002 the roadmap. So you're talking about 8 or 9 peace programs that were proposed, that none of them actually takes place.
None of them
that's because the American support is never there. They always find a reason. If we remember going back to 2002, we heard about, you know, Hamas and Fatah. When they had a united or unified government, they always claimed that Hamas is a terrorist organization and we can't deal with them. So this whole peace initiative was basically written off. Roadmap has never been implemented since, besides Gaza and Ariha, and that basically close to the Jordanian border, close to Jordan.
Most recently, France, the peace efforts, the so-called peace process has stalled for 2 years. And France has volunteered to broker a new round. And Abbas, Palestinian leadership, are saying that we are not interested in direct talks with Israel. Explain why that's the case.
The direct talks basically leads to conflict, because first of all, if we're going to have a direct dialogue for peace, you have to respect the actual rules that we put in place in terms of stopping the settlement. That was #1 condition for Palestinians to sit around the table and talk peace with Israel. Stop settlement. We hear about settlements every day. Every day and every night. They never stop. So if you are breaking the rules, what do you want me to sit around the table and talk to you about? There is nothing. And therefore, they always try to get other countries involved so they can bear witness to what Israel is doing, so they can see. So Israelis can go out in the media and say, well, we try to create an atmosphere to build a peace, but the Palestinians don't want to sit with us. They don't want to sit with you because you're not really respecting the rules. So the issue of settlement was the first, to answer your question, why there's no direct talks. #1 is the issue of settlement. #2 is a total disrespect to the actual Mosque of Jerusalem. There is tunnels under the mosque. They digging, calling, you know, looking for heritage of David and looking for his
Jewish digs.
Exactly,
Israeli
the digs. The David synagogue. There is a semi-mall underground, basically shops and stuff like that, and it basically threatened the mosque to collapse. The most important thing, really, I think, in this whole peace talks is the issue of the capital.
Al-Aqsa.
Yes, because the agreement was that if you're going to have a two-state solution, then the Western Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel and Eastern Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. But then what you find is, before the peace talks really starts, that Israel is already moved to Eastern Jerusalem. So what do you want me to talk about? You already deny me the actual basics of agreement that we wanted to agree upon. And therefore, I think so far the Palestinians have the issue of capital as the main point why they don't want to have a direct talks with the Israelis. At this point, as you kindly mentioned, we've got the last initiative was the French initiative, and that was during the Arab Springs, because the Arabs were too busy, you know, in the revolutions, etc. So the France really put something forward, yet it didn't work. At this point, we've got the initiative proposed by Egypt and supported by Saudi Arabia to try to start a peace talks again. And luckily, there is some positive statements in the media inside Israel, you know, across the entire Middle East, saying, you know, it's a good way to start. So hopefully, we will have this time the political will that they will sit around. But whether the two-state solution will meet the expectations of the Arab, I doubt that, because one of the main pillars of the Arab peace requirements is the capital.
Right, right. Time and again, we hear Palestinian leaders saying that Jerusalem will be the capital.
Exactly.
Now, they don't mean just East Jerusalem. They mean all of...
Yes, but you can pressurize them and they will accept the East. But at this point, Israel is taking both. So you're going to have to really get Israel to do a lot of sacrifices to move back.
Right.
And we've seen such sacrifices never been really done. If you talk about Resolution 242 and 338 of the Security Council, they were required to move back to the lines beyond 1967. So all the land that were taken from 67 on have to be returned. You know, that is including Sinai in Egypt, etc., and Golan Heights. So that is the problem of Israel, is the land. They don't want to withdraw from any land they kept. And this is really what makes it difficult for Palestine or for Palestinians particularly to actually sit around the table and negotiate, because they're going to have to accept any state, whatever it is, without Jerusalem as a capital.
And I think, I don't know if you would agree, this is why we're increasingly seeing people say that, you know, the peace process, quote unquote, is just a ruse to buy time to build more settlements, to reach, eventually, it'll be fruitless to even try to create two states. And so people are saying, well, why don't we just have one state?
If you, and have a federal rule. That could actually be a better solution, but again, how do you control who rules? Because you can have political parties, and in terms of a number, the Israelis might you know, outnumber the Palestinians, so you're going to have parties that are very skewed. How do you really, I mean, if you look at the federal system in Switzerland, for example, you've got the French, you've got the German, Portuguese and Italian, but again, it's very, because you've got the will. So if you've got the will, it's easy to do it.
And that's the thing lacking in this case. Can we go back to some of these historic attempts? We've just said that, you know, there's always, regardless of what's being done and agreed to, the underlying truth is that there's a lack of will.
Yes.
But some of the historic things, Camp David historic agreement, Oslo 93, Arab Initiative, can you talk about some of these things?
In basically took in 181, as we said, just summarize them. 181 is about the two-state rule. So we're going to have two states. That's 181 immediately after the occupation of Palestine. 194 gives a right to Palestinians to return to their land. 242 and 338, they followed each other after 1967 war. And then we got the war in 1973, and we got Camp David in 1979. Camp David basically doesn't include only peace between Egypt and Israel. It includes also the Palestinians, includes the border in certain parts of the Arab, including Golan Heights, etc. So there is a number of areas that we talked, and in terms of the two islands, even the deal between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, it's part of the Camp David. So in terms of Camp David, the Palestinians refused totally the rules of Camp David in 1979 because they don't want to, they said, we don't want to basically take that part that was agreed upon in Camp David. They said, we want all of it based on the illegal occupation of the Israelis. And at that time, there was a major conflict between Sadat and Yasser Arafat around what to accept. Because at that time, the Arabs had no choice Take whatever you can at this point, and that was the point of Sadat. Take whatever you can, and then from that, start building your own army and get more. But they refused totally, and if you remember, they accused Egypt of being, you know, betraying the whole Arab case, and they moved the Arab League headquarters from Cairo to Tunisia. That took also a few years to try to resolve this back, because the entire front against the Israeli occupation was basically damaged. From 1979, basically we've got the assassination of Sadat, 81. From that time, it took probably about 10, 11 years. Nothing is happening. It's just uprising inside, no major support from the Arab world, until we got to Oslo 1993. Oslo was basically a breakthrough after a whole long time of almost a decade and a half of nothing happening from the international community. And basically 1993 Oslo Peace Accord basically put some new initiatives. One of them was to have a one-state solution and have a federal rule, and a lot of people rejected that.
Is this what created the Palestinian Authority?
That's right. But they had some administrative outcome, basically, that gives them that sort of representation. From that time, they started to enjoy some sort of formal representation, but Israel at that time required full acceptance of Israel as a state. You know, not just as an illegal power that is occupying Palestine. So you have to agree that it is a state up front, and most of the Arabs refused that, so it didn't really work again. In 1994, there was a Camp David also peace initiative, and that didn't really go very far. Until 2000, we've got the Arab initiative. That was also a major one. A lot of the Arab countries got involved: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan was part of it. Wadi Arab it's called, and then from there started to see more and more representation to Palestinians. The major one, or the major breakthrough, was 2002, which basically the roadmap. That's where they started to get part of the land. Ariha, that part of Gaza and Ariha, that is on the eastern side of Palestine, on the Jordanian border. Basically on the Jordanian River, that basically splits between Jordan and Palestine. And then we started from there having the actual formation of the Palestinian government. And followed by a few years, we saw Yasser Arafat basically died in there when he got in, and basically with under great pressure over Israel to allow him to get out, because he was at there. So during that time, the last 68 years, you see a lot of initiatives, but again, no proper or political will from the Israeli side. From the Arab side, you need the power. The Arabs, and we always talked about that, the world respects the powerful, doesn't respect the priest, or some sort of weakness that might deserve respect. But in this world of politics, you have to be powerful. And I think the Arabs never had the power to force Israel to sit around the table.
I want to ask you now, all of these failed attempts over the decades, you know, we can't blame Abbas to try and take unilateral action.
There is nothing he can do about it.
He's signing the joining the International Criminal Court. He's making appeals to countries.
In the past 3 or 4 years, he's done great achievements compared to what happened in the last 60 years. In the last 60 years, nothing happened. But he could at least raise the Palestinian flag, and you know, in the United Nations headquarters in New York. So that's an achievement for him. The International Court of Justice. So here, the representation is quite solid. What hammers the actual case in the beginning, and in the end, as we said, that the power of the Arab is not really convincing to the Western society to back off. So always, if you look at even the situation in Syria, Russia and United States are dividing the cake over an Arab territory and Arab resources, and the Arabs are just watching. You know, who's going to fight here? And basically, United States backed off when Russia stepped in. But 23 countries have no weight. And it's a reality. We're not really criticizing them for anything. It's just, it's a reality. The world respects the powerful. So in terms of the Palestinian case, you need a power to actually force Israel to sit and negotiate, even if you just have a proper peace talks. But at this point, Israel is, I mean, you're talking about even the nuclear equipments. You forcing the Arabs to get rid of any nuclear programs, including Iraq and the damage that happened in Iraq, in Iran, but Israel has 450 nuclear heads. So that is only reflecting a weakness.
Eliminate the competition.
Exactly. So it's basically saying that we will put the rule and you will accept it because you're weak.
What about, you know, we had a movement of countries announcing their official recognition of Palestine. Yes. Sweden was the first major Western government to do that in years. Yeah. And there were promises by Britain and France, Spain as well, I believe, saying that if the peace process failed, we would officially recognize. Yeah. I mean,
that's 100% correct. The problem is, it's not sustainable because it always goes back to economic cooperation and economic benefits. So the fact here is whether Sweden will be able to stick to the rule. They won't. They can't. Because at this point, you've got pressure coming from the United States. And look at the situation when Palestine was asking for recognition. United States voted against it.
Right.
So this is the country that's supposed to oversee or basically ensure full peace talks in the region. It's actually voting against it.
And the U.S. and Britain, they systematically condemn settlements.
Exactly.
But when it comes to votes in the UN Security Council, they're always throwing
so the fact here is
Palestine under the bus.
It's absolutely right, because it's all about statements in the media for public consumption. But in reality, you find that countries are signing against Palestine. That's why. What happens if we can get the General Assembly, 120 and 125 countries, get 100 of them to agree to have a Palestinian state? Done. With people just sitting and sign. But in actual reality, it doesn't happen. Because the world is still dominated by United States, number one, followed by Russia, China as the second powers. Australia is still very much anti-Arabs and anti-Muslims, and it still stands against the Arab and the Palestinian case. Yet they take a lot of refugees. So always people, you know, play a double standard. I don't want you to take refugees. I want you to resolve the issue.
That would prevent the refugees in the first place.
Exactly. So if you have a solution for Palestine, you already prevented 6 people to be displaced. Why are you making it difficult? And remember some of the statements of the United States saying that we'll accept annually 50,000 Palestinians. We don't want you to accept them. We don't want them to get out. Because the fact here is they emptying Palestine for Jewish settlements to expand. It's quite clear conspiracy. So the fact here is, do we actually, as Arab, do we understand? I think we do. This is the whole issue, is that we do understand what's happening, yet we don't act about it.
We have 3 minutes, Professor. For this reason, all these failures, all these attempts, people have said that the only option now is boycott. The BDS movement.
Yep.
And it is a very serious threat. And the United States, Britain, France, and Israel are taking measures to punish people legally, to criminalize boycotting Israel, because it's costing them billions of dollars.
Exactly. Boycotting, if you look at boycotting, if we actually take it on the economic activities alone, you know, soft drinks, juice, takeaways, a lot of large chains, American large chains worldwide. And let's not just say worldwide, talk about the 23 countries. Just alone, for the sake of Palestine, we're not going to be boycotting Israel. We're going to be boycotting the superpowers. You don't have the culture of citizens that can actually enforce that. People actually don't know. And they will ask you, you know, if I have this soft drink, what is it going to do to Palestine? He's got no idea what you're actually trying to do. And remember, we talked about illiteracy.
Although, Professor, I want to remind you what happened in 2014 during Ramadan. I think it was India. Yes. They actually boycotted Pepsi and Coca-Cola.
Exactly. But here you need a national media that drives that. In the Arab world, we can't do that. You can't do this in Egypt and say, you know, boycotting Coca-Cola. You can't. You can't. So the fact here is individual citizens can't do that, because most of us, we've got 42% poverty rate. We've got 39% illiterate. So we've got 40% of people can't actually read and write. That's 40% written off. The other 60%, most of them are half educated. So the fact here is you need people with culture to explain to them what is it that you boycotting will do. When you hurt them economically, it will put a pressure on politically. And remember when we talked about oil, we said that King Fahd was the first in the world to realize that oil as a strategic weapon. Here we're going back to actual weapons and resources that we do have. So the fact here is we do have resources. We can use oil. You don't have to boycotting even, cut oil. Use your own reserve, but from now on, we won't give you any resources unless you resolve our cases. But in actual fact, we've got a lot of betraying in the Middle East. So people are giving oil, and other people are cutting deals with the West, and we're losing our own cases.
In terms of prescriptions, would you say eliminating corruption, educational reform, all these kinds of things?
Absolutely. Educational and cultural reform. And lastly, in one of the episodes, we talked about what is the conspiracy in the new Middle East? To have nations without education, without culture, without health, no education, no culture, no health, no management, no armies. So the 5 elements is what we actually basically see now. You need to start with education and culture. You're going to have strong nations. And cultured and educated nations are the ones that can drive the world.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
This brings us to the end of our discussion on Palestine. Very bleak state of affairs. We have to look for ways such as BDS and, of course, praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, committing ourselves in some way to this great human rights crisis. We would like, inshallah, to take a short break and come back to segment 3. We're taking a much lighter note, looking at Surah Al-Baqarah and the Holy Quran, inshallah.